In the military, respect for rank isn't just tradition, it's survival. One wrong word to the wrong person can destroy a career in seconds. Sergeant Marcus Thompson learned this the hard way on what started as an ordinary Tuesday morning at Fort Braxton. He thought he was talking to just another new recruit when he made a joke that would haunt him for the rest of his military life. What happened next didn't just shock him, it sent ripples through the entire base command structure. Sometimes the person standing quietly in the corner, wearing no visible rank, holds more power than everyone else in the room combined. This is the true story of how one sergeant's casual comment to a woman he didn't recognize nearly ended his career and taught an entire military base a lesson about assumptions, respect, and the dangerous game of judging people by their appearance. Sergeant Marcus Thompson had been stationed at Fort Braxton for 8 years, and he knew every corner of the base like the back of his weathered hands. At 32, he carried himself with the confident swagger of someone who had earned his stripes the hard way, through 2 deployments overseas and countless hours of training newer soldiers. His reputation preceded him wherever he went on base. Tough but fair, quick with a joke, and absolutely dedicated to maintaining military standards. The morning of September 15th started like any other. Marcus arrived at the administration building at 0600 hours. His uniform pressed to perfection, boots polished to a mirror shine. The autumn air was crisp, and the base was already buzzing with activity as soldiers prepared for another day of training and administrative duties. Marcus grabbed his coffee from the break room, the same bitter brew that had fueled him through thousands of similar mornings, and settled into his routine. His primary responsibility involved overseeing the integration of new personnel into the base's daily operations. It was work that required attention to detail and a firm understanding of military protocol. Marcus took pride in his ability to spot potential problems before they became serious issues. He had an eye for reading people, or so he thought, developed through years of managing soldiers from all walks of life. The administration building hummed with quiet efficiency that morning. Clerks processed paperwork, officers reviewed reports, and the steady rhythm of military bureaucracy continued its endless march. Marcus reviewed the day's roster of new arrivals, noting several transfers from other bases and a few fresh faces straight from basic training. Nothing seemed unusual or particularly challenging about the day ahead. Around 10:30, Marcus decided to take a break from his paperwork and walk through the building's main corridor. These informal inspections were part of his routine, a way to keep his finger on the pulse of daily operations and ensure everything was running smoothly. As he walked, he greeted familiar faces and exchanged brief words with colleagues, maintaining the casual but respectful atmosphere that characterized his interactions with fellow service members. Near the building's main entrance, Marcus noticed several people gathered around the information desk. Most were clearly new arrivals, evident from their uncertain expressions and the way they clutched their assignment papers. Among them stood a woman who immediately caught his attention, though not for reasons he would later wish. She appeared to be in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her civilian clothes were unremarkable, dark slacks and a plain blue blouse that looked like something purchased from any department store. What struck Marcus as odd was her posture and bearing. While the other new arrivals fidgeted nervously or chattered among themselves, she stood perfectly still, observing everything around her with sharp, calculating eyes. Marcus assumed she was either a new civilian contractor or perhaps a military spouse unfamiliar with base procedures. In his experience, both groups often displayed similar combinations of confidence and uncertainty when navigating military facilities for the first time. Her age suggested she wasn't a new recruit, and her clothing indicated she wasn't currently in service, at least not visibly. The woman's presence nagged at something in Marcus's mind, but he couldn't quite place what bothered him about her. She seemed too comfortable, too observant for someone who should have been overwhelmed by her first day on a military installation. Most civilians required constant guidance and reassurance during their initial visits, but this woman appeared to be cataloging everything she saw with methodical precision. Marcus approached the group at the information desk, partly out of professional duty and partly from curiosity about the unusual woman. The desk sergeant, a young corporal named Williams, was distributing orientation packets and explaining base procedures to the small crowd. Marcus had mentored Williams during his first year at Fort Braxton, and the younger man had developed into a competent administrator under Marcus's guidance. The conversation around the desk was routine. Discussions of parking procedures, building access, and the location of various facilities. Marcus listened with half an ear while continuing to study the woman who had captured his attention. Something about her stillness unsettled him in a way he couldn't articulate. In his experience, people were rarely that composed unless they had significant experience with military environments. As the group began to disperse, each person armed with their orientation materials and initial assignments, the woman remained near the desk. She wasn't asking questions or seeking assistance, but neither was she moving toward her next destination. Instead, she continued her careful observation of the building's activity, as if memorizing details for some future purpose. Marcus decided to approach her directly. In his role as a sergeant, he was responsible for ensuring all personnel, civilian and military, understood their place within the base's structure. If this woman was indeed new to Fort Braxton, she would benefit from his guidance and experience. Moreover, his curiosity about her unusual demeanor had grown too strong to ignore. Walking over with his characteristic confident stride, Marcus prepared to introduce himself and offer assistance. He had performed similar introductions thousands of times throughout his career, always maintaining the proper balance of authority and helpfulness that his rank required. The interaction he was about to initiate seemed routine, just another small part of his daily responsibilities. The woman noticed his approach and turned to face him directly. For a brief moment, Marcus felt something shift in the atmosphere around them, as if the air itself had become charged with an energy he didn't recognize. Her eyes met his with an intensity that suggested she was evaluating him just as carefully as he had been studying her. What Marcus saw in those eyes should have warned him to proceed with caution. They held the kind of depth and sharpness that came from years of making difficult decisions and commanding respect in challenging situations. But Marcus was focused on his assumption that she was simply another new civilian learning to navigate military protocol, and he missed the subtle signs that might have changed the course of their interaction. The moment stretched between them, pregnant with possibilities that Marcus couldn't have imagined. He was about to speak to someone whose identity would transform not just his understanding of the situation, but his entire perception of power, rank, and the assumptions that had guided his military career. The words forming in his mind seemed harmless enough, born from years of casual interactions with new personnel. Marcus had no way of knowing that the next few seconds would become the most significant of his military service, setting in motion events that would ripple through the entire command structure of Fort Braxton. The woman standing before him represented forces and authority so far beyond his experience that his upcoming mistake would become the stuff of base legend, whispered about in mess halls and barracks for years to come. The morning that had started so ordinarily was about to become anything but routine, and Sergeant Marcus Thompson was completely unprepared for what was coming next. Marcus cleared his throat and stepped closer to the woman, his military bearing evident in every movement. His smile was friendly but professional, the same expression he had perfected through thousands of interactions with base personnel and visitors over the years. He genuinely believed he was about to help someone who needed guidance, and his confidence in reading situations had never been seriously challenged. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of his rank. "I'm Sergeant Thompson. I noticed you're new here and thought you might need some assistance finding your way around the base." His tone was helpful but carried the subtle undertone of someone accustomed to being in charge of situations involving newcomers. The woman turned to face him fully, and Marcus caught something in her expression that he couldn't quite interpret. It wasn't confusion or gratitude as he might have expected from someone in need of assistance. Instead, her face showed what looked almost like amusement, though it was controlled and barely visible. She remained silent for a moment, as if waiting for him to continue. "First time on a military installation?" he asked, his tone becoming slightly more casual. "I know it can be overwhelming at first. All the protocols and procedures take some getting used to." Still, the woman said nothing, though her eyes never left his face. Marcus began to feel slightly unsettled by her intense scrutiny, but he pushed the feeling aside. In his experience, some civilians became tongue-tied when interacting with military personnel, especially if they had no previous exposure to military culture. He decided to try a different approach, one that might put her more at ease. "You know," Marcus said, allowing a slight grin to cross his face, "around here, we have a saying about rank and responsibility. The higher up you go, the more people expect from you. He gestured casually around the busy administration building. Me, I'm just a sergeant, so I don't have to worry about impressing too many people. Just have to keep the lower ranks in line and follow orders from above. The comment was meant to be self-deprecating humor, the kind of casual remark that often helped break the ice with nervous civilians. Marcus had used similar approaches countless times to put new people at ease, sharing little jokes about military hierarchy that usually earned appreciative chuckles and helped establish a comfortable rapport. But instead of the expected smile or laugh, the woman's expression changed subtly. The barely visible amusement in her eyes intensified, though her face remained composed. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words with more attention than they seemed to warrant. "Just a sergeant," she repeated quietly, her voice carrying a tone that Marcus couldn't quite place. It wasn't mockery exactly, but there was something in the way she spoke the words that made him suddenly uncomfortable. Marcus nodded, still not recognizing the danger signals that were becoming increasingly apparent. "That's right," he said, his confidence beginning to waver slightly, though he couldn't understand why. "Nothing too fancy about my rank. I leave all the important decision-making to the officers and the really high-ranking folks." He laughed at his own comment, but the sound seemed to fall flat in the space between them. The woman continued to study him with that unsettling intensity, as if she was memorizing every detail of their interaction for some purpose he couldn't fathom. "Important decision-making," she mused, still speaking quietly. "And who would you consider the really high-ranking folks? Sergeant Thompson?" The question caught Marcus off guard. Most civilians didn't probe into military hierarchy during casual conversations, and there was something about the way she asked that suggested more than idle curiosity. But he was committed to his approach now, and his discomfort was beginning to manifest as nervous chatter. "Well, you know, the colonels, the generals," Marcus said, waving his hand dismissively. "Though around here we mostly deal with colonels and maybe the occasional one-star general. The really high-ranking people, the 3- and 4-star generals, they're way above my pay grade. I'd probably freeze up if I ever had to talk to one of them directly." As soon as the words left his mouth, Marcus realized he had been speaking more freely than he intended. Something about the woman's quiet attention had prompted him to reveal more about his thoughts and feelings than was appropriate in a casual introduction to a base newcomer. He tried to recover by returning to his original helpful tone. "But anyway, that's not something you need to worry about," he said quickly. "Whatever brought you to Fort Braxton, I'm sure we can get you pointed in the right direction. Do you have your paperwork with you? I can take a look and see where you're supposed to report." The woman reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, but instead of handing it to Marcus, she held it against her chest and continued to look at him with that penetrating gaze. The gesture seemed almost protective, as if the contents of the folder were not meant for his eyes. "Tell me, Sergeant," she said, her voice taking on a slightly different quality, "what makes you think I need directions?" The question stopped Marcus cold. In all his years of approaching newcomers and offering assistance, no one had ever questioned his assumption that they needed help. The woman's tone wasn't hostile, but it carried an authority that made Marcus suddenly aware that he might have misread the entire situation. I just assumed," Marcus began, but found himself unable to complete the sentence. For the first time since approaching her, he really looked at the woman's posture and bearing, and what he saw made his stomach drop slightly. She stood with perfect military bearing, her spine straight and her shoulders square, in a way that spoke of long habit rather than conscious effort. Her observation of the building's activities hadn't been the uncertain scanning of someone lost or confused, but the systematic assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating operational environments. Even her silence during his introduction now seemed less like nervousness and more like the patient attention of someone allowing him to speak, before making her own position clear. "You assumed what exactly?" The woman prompted, her voice carrying a note of expectation that made Marcus realize he was supposed to provide a specific answer. Marcus felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the building's air conditioning. Everything about this interaction had shifted from helpful guidance to something that felt uncomfortably like an interrogation, though he couldn't understand how or when the change had occurred. "I assumed you were new to the base," he said carefully, "and might need assistance with procedures or finding specific locations." "Based on what evidence?" she asked. The question was asked in the tone of someone accustomed to receiving detailed, accurate answers. Marcus realized that his casual assumptions were being systematically dismantled by someone who clearly understood military thinking far better than he had initially recognized. "Your civilian clothes," Marcus admitted, feeling increasingly foolish. "The fact that I haven't seen you before. Your presence near the information desk." The woman nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she had already suspected. "And you concluded from these observations that I was someone who needed your guidance and assistance." It wasn't a question, but Marcus felt compelled to respond anyway. "Yes, ma'am." "Interesting," she said, and Marcus caught a hint of something in her voice that made him wish he had never approached her in the first place. "Tell me, Sergeant Thompson, in your 8 years at Fort Braxton, how often have you been wrong about your initial assessments of people?" The fact that she knew how long he had been stationed at the base hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had never mentioned his length of service during their conversation, which meant she had obtained that information from another source. His mind raced through possibilities, none of which offered any comfort. How did you?" Marcus began, but the woman raised her hand slightly, a gesture that silenced him immediately. "I think," she said quietly, "it's time for you to see my paperwork, Sergeant." She extended the folder toward him, and Marcus took it with hands that had begun to tremble slightly. As he opened the cover and saw the contents, the color drained from his face entirely. The documents inside weren't the typical orientation materials carried by new base personnel. Instead, they contained orders, clearances, and identification that made Marcus's casual comments about rank and authority seem not just inappropriate, but potentially career-ending. At the top of the first page, in clear, official text, were words that made Marcus's world suddenly shift on its axis. Marcus stared at the document in his hands, reading and rereading the words that seemed to blur before his eyes. The official letterhead of the Department of Defense was unmistakable, and the text that followed made his knees weak. General Patricia Hawthorne, 4-star General, United States Army, Special Assignment, Installation Inspection and Command Assessment. The folder slipped slightly in his sweating palms as the full weight of his mistake crashed down on him. This wasn't just any general. This was a 4-star general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the entire United States military. There were fewer than 40 such individuals in the entire armed forces, and Marcus had just spent the last 10 minutes making jokes about his own insignificant rank to one of the most powerful military leaders in the country. Marcus looked up from the documents to find General Hawthorne watching him, with an expression that had shifted from amusement to something far more serious. Her eyes, which had seemed merely observant before, now carried the full weight of decades of military command. The casual friendliness that Marcus had mistaken for civilian uncertainty was completely gone, replaced by the unmistakable presence of supreme military authority. "General," Marcus managed to croak, his voice barely above a whisper. He tried to snap to attention, but his body felt disconnected from his brain, and his movements were clumsy and uncertain. "General Hawthorne, I had no idea." "At ease, Sergeant," General Hawthorne said, though her tone made it clear that "at ease" was the last thing Marcus should be feeling. "Or perhaps I should say, continue as you were. You seemed quite comfortable sharing your thoughts about military hierarchy a few moments ago." Marcus felt as if the floor was tilting beneath his feet. Everything he had said during their conversation now played back in his mind with horrifying clarity. His casual dismissal of his own rank, his jokes about leaving important decisions to higher-ups, and, most mortifying of all, his comment about freezing up if he ever had to talk to a 4-star general directly. "Ma'am, I sincerely apologize," Marcus began, but General Hawthorne held up her hand again, the same gesture that had silenced him before. "For what exactly are you apologizing, Sergeant Thompson?" she asked. Her voice was controlled and professional, but Marcus could detect an undertone that suggested she was far from finished with this conversation. Marcus's mind raced through possible responses, each one seeming more inadequate than the last. How could he explain that his jokes had been meant as friendly conversation? How could he justify his assumption that she was just another civilian in need of guidance? How could he possibly make amends for treating a 4-star general as if she were a lost visitor who needed his help finding the restroom? "I'm apologizing for my inappropriate comments, ma'am," Marcus said, his military training finally overriding his panic enough to provide a coherent response. "And for my failure to recognize your rank and show proper respect." General Hawthorne nodded slowly, as if considering his words. Inappropriate comments. She repeated, such as your observation that you're just a sergeant who doesn't have to worry about impressing too many people. The way she quoted his exact words back to him made Marcus want to disappear entirely. He had never felt so small or so professionally vulnerable in his entire military career. Yes, ma'am. Or perhaps your comment about leaving all the important decision-making to officers and high-ranking folks, she continued. Yes, ma'am, Marcus repeated, each acknowledgement feeling like another nail in the coffin of his military career. And your particularly interesting observation that you would probably freeze up if you ever had to talk to a 3- or 4-star general directly? Marcus closed his eyes briefly, wishing he could somehow undo the entire conversation. Yes, ma'am. That comment was completely inappropriate. General Hawthorne studied him for a long moment, and Marcus could practically feel her evaluating not just his words, but his character, his competence, and his fitness for military service. The silence stretched between them, filled with the background sounds of the administration building's daily operations, sounds that now seemed to come from another world entirely. Sergeant Thompson, she finally said, how long have you been in your current position? 3 years, ma'am, Marcus replied, grateful for a straightforward question he could answer without further embarrassing himself. And in those 3 years, how many personnel have you processed through this facility? Approximately 1,500, ma'am. 1,500 individuals, General Hawthorne mused. And in all that time, you've never encountered a situation where someone's appearance didn't match their actual position or authority? The question was clearly rhetorical, but Marcus felt compelled to answer anyway. I have encountered such situations, ma'am, but you what? She prompted when he trailed off. But I usually recognize the signs, ma'am. Military bearing, certain mannerisms, the way people carry themselves. I pride myself on being able to read people accurately. General Hawthorne's eyebrows rose slightly. You pride yourself on reading people accurately, she said. Yet you spent 10 minutes offering assistance to someone you believed to be a confused civilian, despite numerous indicators to the contrary. Marcus felt his face burning with shame. Everything she said was true. Looking back, the signs had been there from the beginning. Her posture, her observational skills, her calm confidence in an unfamiliar environment, even the way she had questioned his assumptions rather than gratefully accepting his offered help. You're absolutely right, ma'am, Marcus said. I failed to properly assess the situation, and I acted on assumptions that were clearly incorrect. More than that, General Hawthorne continued, you revealed attitudes and perspectives about rank and responsibility that concern me greatly. Tell me, Sergeant, do you truly believe that being just a sergeant absolves you of the need to maintain professional standards in all your interactions? The question cut to the heart of something Marcus hadn't even realized about himself until this moment. His casual attitude toward his own rank, which he had always thought of as healthy humility, was being revealed as something far more problematic. No, ma'am, he said. Every soldier, regardless of rank, has a responsibility to uphold military standards and show appropriate respect to all personnel. And yet your comments suggest that you view your position as somehow less important or less demanding than those held by higher-ranking individuals. Marcus struggled to find words that might explain his perspective without digging himself deeper into trouble. Ma'am, I didn't mean to suggest that my position wasn't important. I was attempting to put a civilian at ease by using self-deprecating humor. Self-deprecating humor, General Hawthorne repeated. Humor that involved diminishing your own rank and authority while making light of the responsibilities that come with military service. Each word felt like a precision strike against everything Marcus had thought he understood about himself and his role in the military. He had always considered his casual approach to be one of his strengths, a way of connecting with people and making difficult situations more manageable. Now he was discovering that what he had seen as approachable leadership, a 4-star general viewed as unprofessional conduct. Ma'am, I realize now that my approach was inappropriate, regardless of who I believed I was speaking with, Marcus said. A soldier should maintain professional standards at all times, not just when interacting with recognized superiors. General Hawthorne studied him intently, as if measuring the sincerity of his response against his previous behavior. The weight of her attention was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced, even during the most intensive evaluations of his military career. Sergeant Thompson, she said finally. I want you to understand something very clearly. I didn't come to Fort Braxton today to test random personnel or create opportunities for disciplinary action. I'm here conducting a comprehensive assessment of this installation's operational readiness and command effectiveness. Marcus felt his stomach drop even further. An installation assessment meant that every aspect of Fort Braxton's operations was under scrutiny, from the highest levels of command down to individual soldier performance. His interaction with General Hawthorne wasn't just a personal mistake. It was now part of an official evaluation that could affect the entire base. However, General Hawthorne continued, your interaction with me today has provided some very valuable insights into certain aspects of this base's culture and standards. Insights that will definitely be included in my final report. The implications of those words settled over Marcus, like a weight that threatened to crush him entirely. His casual comments and inappropriate assumptions weren't just personal failures anymore. They had become evidence in an official assessment that could impact careers, budgets, and the future of Fort Braxton itself. The silence that followed General Hawthorne's statement stretched for what felt like an eternity to Marcus. Around them, the normal activities of the administration building continued, but Marcus felt completely disconnected from the ordinary world of paperwork and routine procedures. His mind was racing through all the possible ramifications of this encounter, each scenario worse than the last. Ma'am, Marcus finally managed, his voice barely steady, may I ask what specific aspects of our interaction will be included in your assessment? General Hawthorne's expression remained neutral, but Marcus caught a flicker of something that might have been approval at his question. Perhaps asking for clarification showed some level of professional awareness, even in his current state of panic. That's an excellent question, Sergeant, she replied. Let me outline what I observed during our conversation, and you can draw your own conclusions about the implications. Marcus braced himself, knowing that whatever came next would be a systematic dissection of every mistake he had made. First, General Hawthorne began, you approached a person you didn't recognize and immediately assumed they needed assistance, based solely on their civilian clothing and presence near an information desk. This suggests either inadequate situational awareness or a tendency to make rapid judgments without sufficient information. Marcus nodded grimly. Both assessments were damning for someone in his position. Second, she continued, when that person didn't respond as expected to your initial offer of help, instead of reassessing the situation, you doubled down on your assumptions and became increasingly casual in your approach. Yes, ma'am, Marcus acknowledged, remembering how he had interpreted her silence as nervousness rather than the measured attention of a superior officer. Third, you volunteered personal information about your attitude toward your own rank and responsibilities, revealing perspectives that raise questions about professional standards and military bearing throughout this installation. Each point was delivered with the precision of someone accustomed to conducting thorough evaluations, and Marcus realized he was witnessing the same analytical approach that General Hawthorne would apply to every aspect of Fort Braxton's operations. Fourth, she said, when directly questioned about your assumptions, you demonstrated an inability to recognize or adapt to clear signals that you had misread the situation. Marcus felt his face burning with shame. Every point she made was undeniably accurate, and together they painted a picture of incompetence that made him question his own fitness for military service. Finally, General Hawthorne concluded, your comments about higher-ranking officers suggest either a lack of proper respect for military hierarchy or a concerning degree of insecurity about your own place within that hierarchy. The comprehensive nature of her analysis left Marcus feeling completely exposed. What had seemed like a casual conversation to him had been for her a real-time evaluation of his professional capabilities and character, and he had failed that evaluation spectacularly. Ma'am, Marcus said, struggling to find words that might somehow mitigate the damage, I recognize that my performance today was completely unacceptable. Is there anything I can do to demonstrate that this interaction doesn't reflect my usual standards or capabilities? General Hawthorne considered his question for a moment, and Marcus found himself hanging on her every expression, desperate for any sign that his military career might survive this disaster. Sergeant Thompson, she said finally, the question isn't whether you can demonstrate better capabilities. The question is whether the standards and culture that allowed this interaction to occur represent systemic issues that extend beyond your individual performance. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He had been so focused on his own potential consequences that he hadn't fully considered the broader implications for Fort Braxton and his colleagues. If General Hawthorne viewed his behavior as symptomatic of installation-wide problems, the ramifications could be enormous. Ma'am, I want to be clear that my comments and behavior today don't represent the standards or culture of this base, Marcus said urgently. The other personnel here maintain much higher professional standards than what I demonstrated.
Do they? General Hawthorne asked.
Because, from my perspective, you seemed quite comfortable with your approach. You displayed no hesitation or uncertainty about your casual attitude toward rank and protocol. That level of comfort suggests to me that such behavior isn't unusual or discouraged in your normal environment. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but realized that anything he said would either contradict his previous behavior or potentially implicate his colleagues and superiors. He was trapped in a situation where every response could make things worse. At that moment, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Marcus turned to see Colonel Davidson, the base commander, walking toward them with his usual confident stride. Colonel Davidson was a respected leader who had commanded Fort Braxton for 2 years, and Marcus felt a brief surge of hope that his commanding officer's presence might somehow improve the situation. Colonel Davidson approached with a professional smile, clearly intending to greet what he assumed was a base visitor. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. "I'm Colonel Davidson, the commanding officer here. I hope Sergeant Thompson has been taking good care of you." The irony of the colonel's comment, given the circumstances, was not lost on Marcus. General Hawthorne's expression shifted slightly, and Marcus caught what might have been the ghost of a smile at the colonel's unwitting reference to his care. "Good morning, Colonel," General Hawthorne replied, extending her hand. "General Patricia Hawthorne, I believe you should have received notification of my inspection visit." Marcus watched Colonel Davidson's face go through the same transformation his own had experienced moments earlier. The friendly, casual expression drained away, replaced by the sharp attention of a military officer, suddenly realizing he was in the presence of one of the Army's most senior leaders. "General Hawthorne," Colonel Davidson said, his voice immediately shifting to formal military protocol. "Yes, ma'am. We received notification, though we weren't expecting you until later this afternoon. I arrived early," General Hawthorne explained. "I find that early arrivals often provide the most accurate picture of an installation's normal operations." Colonel Davidson's eyes flicked briefly to Marcus, and in that glance, Marcus saw a mixture of concern and growing understanding. The colonel was clearly beginning to piece together what might have transpired during the general's early arrival. "I see," Colonel Davidson said carefully. "And has your initial assessment been informative?" "Extremely informative," General Hawthorne replied, her tone carrying subtle emphasis that made both Marcus and Colonel Davidson visibly tense. "Sergeant Thompson has been most helpful in providing insights into the culture and standards maintained here at Fort Braxton." The way she phrased her response made it clear that Marcus's helpfulness was not the kind that reflected well on the installation. Colonel Davidson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Marcus knew that his commanding officer was beginning to understand the scope of the problem. "Perhaps," General Hawthorne continued, "we should continue this conversation in your office, Colonel. I have some specific observations I'd like to discuss regarding personnel management and professional standards." "Of course, ma'am," Colonel Davidson replied immediately. "Sergeant Thompson, please ensure that all personnel are notified of the General's presence and that appropriate protocols are followed throughout the building." The dismissal was clear, but Marcus hesitated, knowing that his exit from this conversation meant that Colonel Davidson would soon learn the full extent of his failure. Moreover, he would be leaving his commanding officer to face the consequences of his mistakes without any opportunity to provide context or explanation. Actually, General Hawthorne said, "I think Sergeant Thompson should accompany us. His perspectives on installation culture have been quite illuminating, and I'd like to explore them further in our discussion." Marcus felt his heart sink even further. Rather than escaping to deal with his embarrassment privately, he was being required to participate in what would certainly be a detailed examination of his failures. And it still sounds like parasite. Colonel Davidson's expression grew more grim as he processed the implications of the general's request. "Of course, ma'am," Colonel Davidson said. "Sergeant Thompson, you'll join us in my office immediately." As they walked toward the colonel's office, Marcus felt as if he were marching toward his own court-martial. The hallway that he had walked confidently through thousands of times now seemed endless, and every person they passed seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Word of the general's presence would spread through the base within hours, and Marcus's role in her initial assessment would inevitably become part of that story. Behind him, he could hear General Hawthorne and Colonel Davidson exchanging polite but formal conversation, the kind of careful dialogue between senior officers who were still measuring each other's positions and capabilities. Marcus knew that once they reached the privacy of the colonel's office, that careful politeness would give way to a much more direct and potentially devastating discussion of his failures and their implications for Fort Braxton's future. Colonel Davidson's office was a testament to military efficiency and pride, with commendations, unit photographs, and strategic maps covering the walls. Under normal circumstances, Marcus felt comfortable in this space, having attended countless briefings and evaluations here over the years. Today, however, the familiar environment felt like a courtroom where his professional life would be decided. General Hawthorne took the seat offered by Colonel Davidson, while Marcus stood at attention, waiting for permission to sit or speak. The general's presence seemed to fill the room with an authority that made even Colonel Davidson, a seasoned commander himself, appear somewhat diminished by comparison. "Colonel Davidson," General Hawthorne began, settling into her chair with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect in any environment. "I want to discuss what I observed during my initial arrival at your installation." "Yes, ma'am," Colonel Davidson replied, his voice carefully neutral despite the obvious tension in his posture. "Sergeant Thompson approached me in your administration building under the assumption that I was a confused civilian in need of guidance," General Hawthorne continued, her tone professional but carrying an undertone that made Marcus want to disappear entirely. "During our subsequent conversation, he made several statements that I found concerning from the perspective of military professionalism and adherence to protocol." Colonel Davidson's eyes flicked briefly to Marcus before returning to the general. "I see, ma'am. May I ask what specific statements raised concerns?" General Hawthorne outlined the conversation in methodical detail, quoting Marcus's exact words about being just a sergeant, and his comments about leaving important decisions to higher-ranking personnel. As she spoke, Marcus watched Colonel Davidson's expression grow increasingly grave, and he knew that his commanding officer was calculating not just the immediate embarrassment, but the potential long-term consequences for the entire base. More troubling than the specific comments, General Hawthorne continued, was the casual attitude they represented. Sergeant Thompson seemed entirely comfortable with his approach, suggesting that such behavior might be more widespread than this single incident would indicate. "Ma'am," Colonel Davidson said carefully, "while I don't wish to make excuses for inappropriate behavior, I can assure you that Sergeant Thompson's performance has generally been satisfactory during his time under my command." Marcus felt a brief surge of gratitude for his colonel's measured response, though he knew it couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. "Generally satisfactory," General Hawthorne repeated. "Colonel, in your assessment, does generally satisfactory include the kind of casual disregard for military bearing that I witnessed today?" The question was clearly a test, and Marcus realized that Colonel Davidson was now being evaluated just as thoroughly as he had been. The general wasn't just assessing individual performance, she was examining leadership effectiveness and command oversight. "No, ma'am, it absolutely does not," Colonel Davidson replied firmly. "If Sergeant Thompson displayed the behavior you've described, it represents a failure in standards that requires immediate attention and correction." General Hawthorne nodded, but her expression remained serious. "I'm glad to hear that, Colonel, because my concern extends beyond this individual incident. I'm interested in understanding how such attitudes develop and persist within a military unit." Marcus felt the weight of being used as a case study in everything that could go wrong with military culture and leadership. His personal embarrassment was now secondary to his role as evidence in a broader evaluation of Fort Braxton's effectiveness. "Ma'am," Colonel Davidson said, "I take full responsibility for any deficiencies in standards or oversight that may have contributed to this situation. If you would permit me to address these issues internally, I can assure you that appropriate corrective action will be taken." General Hawthorne studied Colonel Davidson for a long moment, and Marcus could see her evaluating not just his words, but his sincerity and his capability to actually implement meaningful change. "Colonel," she said finally, "I appreciate your willingness to take responsibility. However, I think this situation presents an opportunity for something more constructive than simple corrective action. Marcus felt a flicker of hope at her words, though he wasn't sure what she might have in mind. Sergeant Thompson, General Hawthorne said, turning her attention to him directly, I want you to understand something important. Your interaction with me today was a failure in multiple respects, and under normal circumstances, it could have serious consequences for your military career. Marcus's brief hope evaporated. Yes, ma'am, I understand completely. However, she continued, I've seen enough military installations to recognize the difference between individual failure and systemic problems. Your behavior today, while unacceptable, doesn't appear to reflect a broader pattern of unprofessionalism at this base. Colonel Davidson straightened slightly, clearly encouraged by her assessment. Moreover, General Hawthorne said, your willingness to acknowledge your mistakes and accept responsibility suggests that this incident might serve a more valuable purpose than simply ending your career. Marcus looked up, not daring to hope but unable to suppress a slight spark of optimism. Sergeant Thompson, I'm going to make you an offer, General Hawthorne said. You can accept immediate disciplinary action for your conduct today, which will likely result in demotion and a permanent mark on your service record. Or you can accept a different kind of consequence. Marcus waited, knowing that whatever alternative she proposed would probably be more challenging than standard discipline. I want you to develop and implement a comprehensive training program for all personnel at Fort Braxton, focused on professional standards, situational awareness, and proper military bearing in all interactions, regardless of the apparent rank or status of the individuals involved. The scope of what she was proposing hit Marcus immediately. She wasn't just asking him to create a training session. She was requiring him to become an expert in the very areas where he had failed, and then to teach those standards to his colleagues. This program will be subject to my approval and ongoing evaluation, General Hawthorne continued. You'll have 6 months to develop, implement, and demonstrate measurable improvements in installation-wide adherence to these standards. The success or failure of this program will determine whether your military career continues. Marcus realized that she was offering him an opportunity to transform his greatest professional failure into his most significant contribution to military service. The challenge was enormous, but it was also exactly the kind of high-stakes opportunity that could define the rest of his career. Ma'am, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what was being proposed. I accept your offer, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to prove that today's failure doesn't represent my true capabilities or commitment to military service. General Hawthorne nodded approvingly. Colonel Davidson, you'll provide Sergeant Thompson with whatever resources and support he needs to make this program successful. Its effectiveness will also be a factor in my overall assessment of this installation's leadership. Absolutely, ma'am, Colonel Davidson replied immediately. We'll make this program a top priority. 6 months later, Marcus stood before a group of visiting officers from other installations, presenting the Professional Standards Program that had become a model for military bases throughout the region. The training materials he had developed were being implemented at facilities across the country, and his name was associated with innovations in military professionalism rather than embarrassing failures. As he concluded his presentation, Marcus caught sight of a familiar figure in the back of the room. General Hawthorne had returned to Fort Braxton to observe the final evaluation of his program, and the slight nod of approval she gave him was worth more than any commendation he had ever received. The program had exceeded all expectations, resulting in measurable improvements in professional standards and earning recognition from senior military leadership. More importantly, it had transformed Marcus from someone who casually dismissed his own rank into a passionate advocate for military professionalism at every level. After the presentation, General Hawthorne approached him with an expression that was far different from their first encounter. Sergeant Thompson, she said, or should I say, Staff Sergeant Thompson, referencing the promotion he had received as a result of his program's success. You've demonstrated that failure can be transformed into excellence with the right commitment and effort. Thank you, ma'am, Marcus replied. I learned more from our first conversation than from any other experience in my military career. General Hawthorne smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he had ever seen from her. Good leaders, she said, are often distinguished not by their absence of failures, but by their ability to learn from those failures, and use them to become better servants to their country and their fellow soldiers. As she walked away, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. What had begun as the most embarrassing moment of his military career had become its defining achievement. He had learned that true military bearing wasn't about knowing your place in the hierarchy, but about maintaining the highest standards regardless of who might be watching. The story of his encounter with General Hawthorne had indeed become legendary at Fort Braxton, but not as the tale of embarrassment he had once feared. Instead, it had become a story about redemption, growth, and the transformative power of learning from mistakes. Young soldiers now heard it as an example of how failure could become the foundation for extraordinary success. Marcus never again made assumptions about anyone based on their appearance or apparent status, and he never again joked about his rank as if it were unimportant. He had learned that every interaction, no matter how casual it might seem, was an opportunity to demonstrate the professionalism and respect that defined military service at its best. Most importantly, he had discovered that sometimes the people who challenge us most severely are the ones who believe most strongly in our potential for growth and excellence.